Okay, so we are sitting here today with Trip Gabriel. Trip is a New York Times reporter who began working for the Grey Ladies Styles Department in 1994 and became the founding editor of the Sunday Style section in 97. And then a couple years later, well, 10 actually, the Thursday Style section. In 2004, Trip conceived the extremely popular Modern Love column, which has been turned into books, a podcast, and even a TV show. In 2010, Trip hung up his editor hat and began reporting on education, writing several stories about how technology was transforming education. 2 years later, he became a national correspondent on the politics desk. One of his more notable articles included a 2019 profile on Iowa House Republican Steve King, where King questioned why the terms white nationalist and white supremacist were considered offensive. Those comments, widely condemned by Republican leadership, led to King being stripped of committee assignments. And Tripp's article helped contribute to King's loss in the 2020 Republican primary. During his 12 years covering politics, Tripp lived in Iowa throughout the 2015 election, beginning of the election cycle, covering the run-up to the state's famed caucus. And he has also earned notoriety for his coverage of Republican Party's use of critical race theory as a cultural wedge issue. Ben Carson's lack of foreign policy knowledge was another topic he covered during his 2015 presidential run. And he also covered Pete Buttigieg's political rise and 2020 presidential campaign. In 2023, Tripp moved over to the obituaries desk, where he's written about the deaths of notable figures ranging from Lynn Conway, who Tripp described as a, quote, pioneering computer scientist who was fired by IBM in the 1960s after telling managers that she was transgender, and Sammy Basso, a 28-year-old advocate with a rare condition called progeria that causes rapid aging, to Soma Golden Bear, the first woman to serve as the Times national editor, who Tripp described as, quote, a centrifuge of story ideas. They flew out of her in all directions. He's also written about not-so-beloved figures like Paul F. Orfis, who Tripp described, this is my favorite, the pugnacious head of Dow Chemical, who grew and diversified the company at the same time that he rebuffed Vietnam veterans over Agent Orange, argued that the chemical dioxin was harmless, and oversaw the manufacturing of silicone breast implants that were known to leak. Prior to the New York Times, Tripp wrote for magazines such as Rolling Stone, Outside, and Sports Illustrated. Hi. Hello, Tripp. How are you?
I'm well. It's always a shock to hear your life,
Right?
condensed
Into like a 2-minute little...
into a 2-minute, but particularly that's a lot of years you covered, but you did
yeah.
You did it well. Thank you.
Very succinctly. I want to start by doing one of my favorite things, which is a rapid fire word association.
Okay.
So I'll say a word and it'll be our little warm up. Tell me what comes to your mind. Mm-hmm. Deadline.
Life.
Politics.
Fraud.
Death.
Increasingly approaching.
Oh.
That's 2 words.
That's okay. Mine are, well, and not all of mine are one either. Reporting.
Exciting.
Objectivity.
The ideal.
Fact-checking.
Very important.
Fourth estate.
I was always a little confused by that. I know what it means. I'm not, and I'm running on adding a whole lot of other words. But
That's
I always,
okay.
when people say that, I wondered, well, what are the other 3 estates? I do know, but the fourth estate is, it's a front page term. I like it.
Yeah. Freedom of the press.
Essential.
Off the record.
To be honored.
All the news that's fit to print.
A darn good motto.
I agree. Okay, so.
I broke your rules and gave you multiple
No,
words,
it's okay. Mine were supposed to be 1 and they weren't even 1, so. All right, I'm gonna dive right in with my first big question. Sex, politics, and death, which are 3 topics you are told you shouldn't talk about at the dinner table or at dinner parties, and yet those are 3 of the main topics you've covered for the Times. Why?
I think that, and it's probably true of any writer or maybe even any artist, you you should work on and write about, what's a little bit scary, and not take the safe path. And when I was a style editor, writing about relationships and sometimes sexuality and certainly love, felt like a big important topic. And I wanted to be a politics writer because I had no training in it, and I was at that point, I guess, in my 50s. But it was the topic that I read the most about in the newspaper, and I was, pretty worked up about the governing our country and the process of becoming elected and what that was involved. So I reached out and grabbed hold of that. And death. Well, it's inevitable, and as we get older, I'm more aware of it, and you can't ignore it. So you should throw yourself into the stuff, into the deep end of the pool, and sometimes the stuff that scares you.
Yeah. Tell us the story behind creating the Modern Love column. Who or what inspired you, and why do you think it's been such a huge success?
Well, it certainly never felt like it was going to be a huge success. I mean, it started very humbly, but I loved and always have loved reading personal essays by top writers and people with real literary voice. And there was a bit of a tradition at the New York Times prior to when I became an editor. There were a couple of columns in the paper of personal essays. One was called the Hers column, which was born in the 1970s during the women's movement. And then there was a corresponding column called About Men, the New York Times Magazine published in the 1980s about, and these were very well written pieces, and not big news, but very important news, basically, how people related to their lives and how they thought about gender. And I wanted to continue that tradition, but in a new way, which turned out to be about relationships and had not just male and female voices, or to have male and female voices, and to introduce a topic that I knew, if it was well written and well handled, would be a magnet for readers. Turned out that it's you don't get an opportunity very often in your life to do something that's an instant success, but this one surely was. I mean, from the very first few weeks, people discovered it, and we began the column in 2004, soliciting essays from established and well-known writers, and that's a lot of work that you have to, if you're an editor, to make those calls and to get people that are busy to, send you something on deadline. But very quickly after that, we published a little email address at the bottom of one of the columns, like Modern Love at NY Times. It didn't introduce it, didn't say anything about it. People said, "Oh, maybe I should write one of these essays," and it just opened the floodgates, and hundreds, well, literally thousands of essays, came to us unsolicited, and it's been the case for the last 20 years. I mean, I don't edit the column at all anymore. In fact, I handed it off right at the beginning to the current editor, Daniel Jones, who's been doing it for 20 years, and he does all the heavy lifting, but he's never had to solicit an essay.
Were you surprised that it took off so quickly?
I was, yeah. I mean, I knew the power and the potential of that kind of writing, but I don't think there was any other model like it in journalism at that time. It's more of a magazine thing than a newspaper thing, but most magazines have dedicated columnists that write about relationships, and,
right.
and they have name brands and stuff. But it's very rare to have something that there's a different writer every week, and we've had very celebrated writers and people who've never written anything. And the guy that does the actual line editing of the piece, Dan Jones, is very gifted, because he takes a lot of people who are not accomplished professional writers but have a great story or an interesting story, and works that helps them express it. So I will confess I'm not, I don't read it regularly anymore. I've moved on a long time ago to a lot of other interests, and my life is not that focused on
Modern love.
on love relationships. I've been married for a long time, and I'm not in the dating and the mating world, but it is, clearly it's a hit. So,
Yeah, I know many writers whose dream, I mean, journalists, right? But one of their dreams is to have a modern love piece.
it's a topic that everybody's got something to say, right? I
Right.
mean, it's about relationships, and it's a very broadly understood. I mean, love is in the title, and these are romantic relationships, but there's an endless number of permutations of how. I'm amazed that you can still have some novelty to it. I mean, we've had
Right.
all kinds of ways of writing about this, basically the same story. But
Yeah.
good for the writers and the readers. I mean, people, it's somewhere in my bio it's listed, and 10 years on the campaign trail around the country. That was often the thing that people wanted to ask about. They didn't care about Mitt Romney or Barack Obama or Donald Trump, but they wanted to know, oh, tell me about modern love. So it has an enduring and a universal appeal.
Did you have like a little 2 or 3 sentence talking points that you just said every time?
Not really. I mean, I think I talked about the way I'm speaking about it with you. It's just I was always very touched that the essays meant a lot to people. I mean, I'm a writer and a former editor, so I recognize good work and good writing, and they meant a lot, and I understood their power. But I'm always impressed that so many people read it, and it connects with them, and as you say, some people want to contribute to it, and it's not. I don't even. Does it even pay? I guess it probably pays. I should know a few $100, but that's not the point. I don't even think it's the byline that people want. As part of their career. I think they just want. It's very personal material, and it's what we were talking about a minute ago. I mean, when you're a writer, you should write about the most personal, moving, dangerous stuff. Whether you're a novelist or an essayist, and that is, and this topic is, it covers that.
If you were manning the style desk today, would you do anything differently than what they're doing now?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I don't want to criticize the current
Would you
version
introduce
of it. I mean,
something
I'm not a regular reader of the style department. There's been 2 or 3 editors since I left. My interests have moved away from
Right.
that kind of material. And I might just be very prejudiced, but I feel like it doesn't have the zing in some ways that it used to. And I think some of that's the nature of our culture. It's very professionally done. The writing is well done. It's well edited. It doesn't feel as compelling to me as it once did. But that might just be because when I was involved in it,
You were more passionate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I'd have to. I throw that out with a huge caveat that I'm no longer, the target audience for
Right.
it, or the guy that was assigning all those stories.
Right. Let's talk about your stint in education. It was only 2 years. Why so short?
I loved covering education. Was it 2 years? I guess it really was, because I have a lot of those stories still. I still remember quite well, and I think had impact. And I had a great. I'd been an editor for 12 years, and when I wanted to go back to reporting, I had conversations with the masthead of the Times, what I might do, and I had not had a traditional journalism career, even though I've been at the Times for 31 years. I did not, come in as I'd never worked at a daily newspaper before I joined the Times, and I did not rise up through the traditional kind of series of beats that you get,
Right.
covering the cops, covering,
Yeah.
covering traffic, covering, things if you were a Metro reporter. So, I wasn't sure what I wanted to cover when I gave up styles, but education was a topic that I in that period of my life, maybe it's because my kids were, in high school, I guess, at that point, and they're just getting out of high school, and I had a wonderful beat. I ended up, I could write, I was a national education reporter, so I could write about New York City schools, and the charter school movement was exploding in that era, or I could write about, education nationally and sort of digital learning or hybrid learning, was just entering American classrooms in a big way, and so the technology angle was really interesting. And at the same time, George W. Bush, the second Bush, had kind of changed. Had brought a lot of focus to American schooling, through what they called the No Child Left Behind Act. So there was a lot of emphasis on trying to close the achievement gap between white students and non-white students, which is one of the great embarrassments and shames in this country's public education system. And it was a very honest effort, that the second President Bush, kind of introduced to the country, but it put a lot of pressure on schools. So there was a lot of, so there was a very strong kind of policy element to covering, American education. But I wrote about mental health, at the college level. My very first education story. This is funny, not funny. This is interesting in some ways. I mean, I don't think I'd written an article in 10 years. And then the first weekend, I was about to cover education. I was walking downtown, and a guy I knew who had a child at Cornell, said, "Oh, I don't know if you heard about this, that there's been 3 suicides on the campus of Cornell." And
all in the same spot, right? They jump off. There's like a bridge.
Yeah, unfortunately, the campus it's well, it's not unfortunately. I mean, it's a beautiful campus, but it is bisected by these deep gorges with bridges across from, and kids had jumped off the bridges there, one after another, and so I just raced up there, and I didn't even talk to the editor. I think I just went there. I went there so quickly. I didn't have a laptop computer. Certainly didn't have a cell phone, but I knew it was a news story. So I wrote that piece in a very emotional kind of weekend at Cornell. And
who did you interview? Who did you interview?
I interviewed the president of the university at that point. I interviewed the head of the Student Mental Health Association. Cornell, at least in various moments of its history, has had a false reputation as a so-called suicide school. There have been suicides on campus, but many schools have. Many colleges have had that, unfortunately. But it had an excellent mental health department, and they had addressed all the stresses on contemporary college students, and suicide was not the only one. I mean, and there were reasons for all this, and I became very interested in this subject and wrote a lot about it. There was just a wave of, there were kids in colleges in the 2010s that in the past might not have found themselves at universities. I mean, the whole generation of drugs that allowed people with, severe, mental disorders to function in society had brought kids into campus, that might not have been there otherwise. But there were also, sort of ailments that I was never aware of when I was an undergraduate. There was a lot of self-cutting among mostly women, and I don't think the suicide rate had really risen much among that particular population, but there was a lot more focus on it.
Yeah.
And anyway, it was something that I wrote a fair number of pieces about. So I wrote about plagiarism, being a big issue on campus. I mean, the internet was, years ago, when I was first hired by the Times. I worked at the Times for a couple of years as a reporter before I became an editor of the style department. But I was very interested in what we would call internet culture, because, I came to the Times in 1994, and I brought the first modem to my department. Nobody was online, really. And it was a dial-up modem that you plugged into your telephone, and, So I was, a bit of a early adopter of the internet, and there was no web in those days. You connected to people on things like
wow.
bulletin boards and
Yes,
stuff.
I
And I
remember.
wrote some of those. So I was very interested in that and how and how it was changing. How people interact and found each other. But one of the pieces I wrote was about sort of computers on campus being wired together, and I went up to Dartmouth to do this story, and Dartmouth was famous. It was like the first campus that had email. There was a campus email system that before any other campus in the country had it, and people didn't even have it. You didn't even have email on your personal computer in your room. You had to go to a terminal, on campus, like a kiosk or a bank ATM, and they were set up, and students would line up to, write, it was called blitzmail, write messages to one another. So that would have been 95, 96, something like that. But you could see it coming. You could
Yeah.
feel that that the internet was going to change campus life, and so and one of the things that changed, the internet changed was kind of lowering the barriers to plagiarism. So by the time I was an education reporter around 2010, 2011. I wrote a number of stories about plagiarism, which was becoming much more common, at least according to the educators on campuses, and and it was interesting to explore the reasons why.
Yeah.
So.
What did you take away? Like, what did you learn from covering education?
I was interested in education policy. We talked a little bit about No Child Left Behind and charter schools, and one of the fascinating things about covering education is, there is a large, there are big arguments about, school choice and accountability, and the imbalances and inequities in American education. I mean, we're sitting here in northern Westchester, where my family moved, and when I was a child, to Chappaqua, and maybe many of your readers' families moved because we have great public schools. But that's a privilege that you can do if you have a certain income. If you're stuck, if you're in the lower middle classes and you're stuck in an inner city, you don't have that luxury, and you can only send your kids to the traditional school. So how schools are funded in our country, has created, great inequalities and perpetuated, our class structure and our inequalities, and so education is, part of that. But the arguments about, how to structure education do not fall, neatly into like left and right or Democrat and Republican, the way every other political issue in our in our lives seems to now be sorted. But
Right.
there was a kind of a culture war. There was a lot of Democrats that were in favor of charter schools or so-called school choice, and President Obama was a backer of that movement, and a lot of the charter schools in New York City were founded by liberal-leaning people and Democrat-leaning people, and so it didn't shake out the way so many other education other issues same-sex marriage or all the other stuff that the country fights about as a cultural issue. So I guess that's my big takeaway. I like that about it. I mean, it was a vision that you could actually have interesting policy disagreements and not automatically choose the side that fit whether you were you identified yourself as a Republican or a Democrat.
Yeah. Speaking of, let's move to politics, which was a big part of your career. I guess maybe the biggest, since it was 12 years versus 10 at the Styles, but at the Style section. Do you feel like your approach to covering politics changed over the 12 years that you were reporting on it?
Well, politics changed. I mean, I
Fair.
started out. I covered the last, what I would call normal American presidential election in 2012, Obama was running for re-election, and the Republicans nominated a very traditional Republican presidential nominee, Mitt Romney. So I covered that, and then Trump, just blew up the Republican Party, and he blew up a lot of the alliances that that American voters had kind of fit themselves into, and I think the great struggle covering politics in this country for journalism, the New York Times and most other, whether you want to call it, mainstream media or traditional media, or professional media, which I sometimes prefer, it's been struggling to cover, what's going on, with the same principles that underlie, independent journalism in America, which are, striving for objectivity, striving for balance, fact checking what people say, being honest with your readers, not being, a partisan, organ, and that's come under much more stress, obviously, in the last decade, and it's for all kinds of reasons.
Did you find it got harder once?
Excuse me?
Did it get much more difficult to write about or to cover once Trump entered?
I didn't find it was hard to cover. And one of the things that people just say, well, I spent a lot of time covering swing states and a lot of Republican, and I kind of focused a lot on Republican candidates and Republican voters, and people would often ask me, well, do they spit in your face when they hear you're from the liberal New York Times, and do they turn their back on you? And I always, and no, not at all. I mean, I always had very respectful and interesting and meaningful conversations with people who were pretty far to the right, in places that are a lot different than northern Westchester, in deep red America, and in rural places, and one-on-one, I always found it rewarding and meaningful to interview people and to write about where they were coming from and what their perceptions were and what they wanted out of from government. It did become harder because there was a lot of beating up on the refs. There was a lot of attacking the news media. There was a lot of attempting to disqualify the news media by calling it fake news. There was a huge, independent, newspapers in this country have been decimated by the internet, and what drives the internet is not factual and objectivity. It's driven by opinion and outrage and engagement and trying to create engagement by outraging people. So it has changed the way news is consumed. Traditional news is consumed. It's certainly changed the impact that traditional media has. I mean, I don't mind saying this. I mean, the New York Times was probably a much more influential paper in terms of politics, 15 years ago or 20 years ago, or even when I started in 2012. I mean, we have our readership is stronger and larger than ever, and we had a great boom in our business in the first Trump administration and then COVID came along because people had a hunger for honest and objective news, which, I spent a lot of time in state capitals in Pennsylvania and Ohio and Iowa and Arizona, and you go into the the newsrooms of those places, which used to have 15 or 20 or 30 reporters from state papers and radio stations all around the state, aggressively covering state politics. And now the tumbleweed, blows through the middle of those rooms because so many of those outlets have gone out of business. And they've gone out of business because the internet has changed the business of journalism. And it's just a great loss to democracy in our country. It's a they call swaths of our country news deserts. It's very hard to find professionally reported news, and it's not that people aren't consumed by information. They certainly are. They're spending more hours, I'm sure, on their phones, and on social media, consuming some kind of information than they ever did.
Right.
But it's it's partisan. It's driven by tribalism. It's not especially accurate.
Or it's
that has changed what I do and what everybody in my business does. Hopefully we try to maintain the same standards and principles and values, but it's that the market for that product is smaller than it used to be.
Yeah, or they're reading about celebrities or internet celebrities and not, which don't really impact.
I think
their
that's
lives.
always been the case. And as somebody who used to write about celebrity or edited a section that two sections that had a lot of celebrity coverage and or fashion coverage, and it was considered fluffy by some readers, but I don't think that's the problem.
No, but people didn't do it exclusively, and I feel like a lot of people now.
That's all they focus on.
Yeah.
Possibly, yeah. I mean, I was around when the first kind of celebrity magazines, became big newsstand sellers. Sort of the People and its many imitators, all during the '80s and '90s, and I think there's always been a pretty strong market for. Yeah. For movie stars and rock people, and it's sports. Obviously, I mean it's all a degree of escapism in some level, but I don't find that's the competition to to professional news is from
Right.
If you want to spend all your time reading about celebrities, that's fine.
It's safe.
Yeah, I think that's fine. I'm more concerned with people whose information about the big issues of our lives, is not, is tainted by misinformation, disinformation, just tribal partisanship for the sake of, scoring points. I think that's a much more of a threat than somebody reading about, whoever these folks are on the cover of In Touch who I've never heard of,
Same. So I always say to my kids who have their very strong political views, they're young, they're teenagers, I encourage them to talk to people who view politics and life differently than them and really listen. And I always encourage them to find out why, right? What is the reason that someone believes the opposite of what you believe? Because until you really understand that, you can't appreciate where they're coming from, right? You just think they're crazy because they think differently than you. So my question to you is, and you don't need to give me your political affiliation if you have one at all, but did your views on politics or your views on why people feel certain ways, especially because you covered mostly voters, change over the years you covered politics?
It made me a lot more empathetic, I'll say that. I mean, I grew up in the New York suburbs. I've lived, I'm a member of the American elite. I went to a good college. I have a professional career. I've lived in New York City and the San Francisco Bay Area. So I grew up in a blue bubble, both professionally and geographically, and I had, and I embraced most of the life, perspective of someone from that background. And, in 2015, the politics editor, said, I want to send you to Iowa for the year, for the run-up to the caucuses, which is the first nominating contest. And she says, you seem like a Midwestern type of guy. And I said, well, that's weird. I've never lived anywhere, except,
Coast.
between New York and California. But, I'll take it. I think what she meant, I'm not sure exactly what she meant. I think she thought I was, kind of a normal person.
Right, right.
So, but it's a long way of saying, spending all that time, living and talking to voters in places like Iowa or Wisconsin or Missouri, I became much more empathetic or sympathetic, to their perspectives. I didn't necessarily change my politics, but it certainly made me recognize that, we are a much too tribal country and a much too tribal system right now, and these, most Americans, are of good faith and have the views that they have for, good faith reasons. They're often, they were raised that way. I mean, you can be a cradle Republican, you can be a cradle Democrat. Your family, raised you a certain way. You embrace those values. You know, most of us, we're not John Locke. We're not political philosophers. We take on the values, because of the communities we live in and the families we live in, and they're legitimate to a degree. So traveling as much as I did and interviewing people, from far more different backgrounds than I have, or all my friends have, really, or most of my friends have. I gained a broader sympathy, I hope, to where they're coming from. And this is, I sometimes check out of, very fierce political arguments, that sometimes take place right on the dinner table of this house, because, I just, I feel like, it's a much broader country than a lot of us think
Yeah.
of, when we kind of express our politics and particularly our more passionate, views. So.
Switching to obituaries. My burning question, is it true that the obituaries of celebrities are mostly written way before they pass on?
Yes, it is true, and it's not just celebrities, but we call them advances. So, if somebody who's well known or has had and well known is not the criterion, but if you've had a substantial life and a high impact career, and you die at 2 p.m. on the afternoon in New York, we don't want to have to scramble to come up with a few thousand substantial words, in a matter of hours. So obituaries of prominent people are pre-written. Not everyone. I mean, you get caught out sometimes.
Right.
But there's an inventory of over 2,000 advance
Wow.
obituaries. Some of them are. Well, when Jimmy Carter just died at the
Right,
age of
it was
100,
fast.
the bylines on the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the Philadelphia Inquirer obituaries were by reporters who were dead.
I was going to ask you, who gets the byline? So whoever had been really working on that draft.
Well, these were drafts, were probably commissioned when Carter was 70, 75. And a couple of them were co-bylined by more recent living reporters who had a lot to update. But yeah, if you live that long, you're going to outlive your obituarist, if that's the word. But I've written a handful of advances. They're more in depth, and and you get some time to work on them.
Yeah.
More than a breaking news obituary of somebody who dies just on a Monday, and you want to publish as soon as you can.
Do you call the person and interview them?
You do. You don't have to, but yeah, you should. I do. I've it's a little bit it's the opposite. The structure of reporting is the opposite from most any other news story. When something happens and you're a reporter assigned, you just start making calls and you kind of don't really know very much about it, and you kind of report your way into the story. With an advance obituary, it's at least the way I do it is it's pretty much well in hand. I've done the research into somebody's life, and I've written a fairly thorough first draft or second draft, and then I call the person to ask specific questions, and so it's you know more about it. I mean, my colleague David Sanger, who wrote Henry Kissinger's obituary before he died recently, I think David said he worked on it for 3 years. I mean, he's a national affairs security, journalist, has been at the Times forever, and I think he traveled, to catch up with Kissinger in various places, and Kissinger told him, this is like one story I'm not going to be able to call in and complain about.
Right, no advance
Which
copy.
is true. Which is true. So it's an unusual conversation, and you try to go over, you know, controversial moments of a public figure's life and see if they have, if there's more information that they want to, reveal that wasn't necessarily, part of the record when it took place, or whether it's time to say, set the record straight in some way, and or obviously it's so it's an interesting conversation.
How do you start that? Do you say, I'm Trip Gabriel calling from the obituaries desk?
Most people, frankly, who are well known, particularly, and I've done mostly politicians in the politics field, are aware of the convention of an advance obituary. So I usually approach them by email or text, rather than just cold calling them, and they're pretty aware of it and pleased.
Yeah.
And to have that opportunity to talk to you, they know this is going to be, a last big article.
Right, right.
And many of them are 20 years past when they were newsworthy, and it's a fun opportunity to kind of look back. Yeah.
What inspired you to write obituaries?
So in November of 2023, I was not looking forward to covering another presidential election. I mean, I was on my fourth presidential election, and at that point, you may remember, it just looked like it was going to be a grim repeat of the 2020 election. I mean, the Republicans were going through the motions of having a primary, but Donald Trump was like skipping every debate, and I was going out to Iowa to kind of go through the motions, and it just felt really, the air had gone out of it, and the Democrats seemed to be on a forced march to renominate Joe Biden, and having covered the 2020 election, I just didn't want to do a rematch between these two particular candidates, and I felt so I was looking for something else to do. The obit desk is is one of the great delights of of journalism. A lot of people might not think that. You're not, generally, except for these advances we were talking about, you're generally not talking to the people you're writing about are dead. So
Right.
There's not a lot of kind of crucial interviewing you're going to do. But I like history, and I'm at the stage of my life where a lot of the people who are passing away, shaped the world that I grew up in, and I'm continually revisiting, stuff from the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, and it's across all different, fields, politics, popular culture, religion, something I didn't really know very much about, but I've written a number of obituaries of religious figures. So, a lot of this stuff sort of comes back up, and it's interesting to kind of put it in perspective and delve back into it. And so, I quite enjoy it. It was just, it's, it's quieter. I was spending, a lot of time on the road as a politics reporter for years, and, running all around the country, and it's nice not to have to do that anymore.
Yeah,
And
it wears on you.
it's a lot quieter. Most of the reporting is from stuff that's already been written, about somebody's record, and you're wandering through the archives of the Times, or the archives of oral histories that people have, done interviews for, or books they've written, and occasionally you're talking to some other people that knew them, but not that much.
What's easier to fact check, politics or obituaries?
To fact check, well, obits are, yeah. I mean, most of the stuff is about somebody's life is on the record, and you can find it. And there are some things that are not. I mean, one of the things I find is that people like to take credit for stuff, and so big events, if it's during somebody's presidency, or it's lots of people take credit for successes, and it can be hard to sort of pin down exactly who did what to whom, and whether and you really want to be right about that if you're going to write an obituary of somebody. I mean,
Yeah.
you don't want to take their word for what they did, or so you go back and you do a lot of that, and but
Couple of general questions, journalism-wise.
Sure.
What's the weirdest or most embarrassing thing you've ever done to get a story?
oh, okay, well I may have to think about that. The weirdest or most embarrassing thing I've ever done to get a story.
Just sneak in, climb over a fence, climb over a fence and get in.
Oh, I was not that kind of reporter. I didn't do a lot of trespassing to get a story.
We can come back to it.
No. Well, I was when Trump was in Iowa, in 2015. I'd written some critical pieces about him, basically saying that his operation in Iowa was a mess, because he was brand new, had never run for
Right.
anything, and they were true, but he was very unhappy with that, and he was denouncing the Times from the stage, and he had an appearance at a Pizza Hut, which is a chain of restaurants in the Midwest where Republican candidates particularly like to meet and greet people, and he was appearing at a Pizza Hut in central Iowa, and I was excluded from it. I was not, I had my press credentials, but I wasn't supposed to be. They didn't want me in there, because I had written apparently some negative stuff about him or critical stuff about him, and so. But I did. I crashed that event, to cover that, and he had his. Or his state director had me escorted out by the local police. So I'm not sure if that qualifies
really
for
funny.
the record, but yeah. A preview of his attitude toward the media, which
Right.
got more and more. I wouldn't say hostile. Is just he just he used the media as a foil. The way I mean, all politicians, Republicans and Democrats, hate their coverage. At certain points in their career, they always feel like the press is not, is not doing them justice. But but the great tradition in our country was, you tolerate it. It's part. If you're running for
Right.
office, it's part of the business. You're going to be covered. You're going to be covered, aggressively. You're not going to like stuff that is reported, and it's not necessarily that there's some opinion in a piece that you don't agree with. You just don't like the details or the facts or the stories that are dug out. But Trump, went beyond, tolerating it as part of the process to actively, using. He wasn't the first one to do it. Barry Goldwater did it, and Richard Nixon did it. But he made the media, the enemy, which fit in with a particular narrative in this country that that the right has embraced, and so.
Do you have a go-to or favorite question that you often or always ask during interviews?
I don't. You mean like was it Barbara Walters who used to ask, if you were a tree, what would you be? Or I don't want to demean Barbara Walters, a great journalist,
No.
but I don't. I mean, I am. I do a lot of research, but if I can, if I'm interviewing somebody, I try to learn as much as I can. And the questions come out of my knowledge of that person. So they're always pretty specific to them. So I wish I did. I wish I had a go-to question that would reveal somebody's character, and in a way. But that would. Do you have one that
Yeah.
works? Are you gonna ask me it?
I will. I mean, I'll ask it to you later and I'll tell you.
Okay. Yeah.
I ask it towards the end of a profile interview.
Oh. Okay.
What do you love most about journalism?
I like learning things. I mean, I will cynically say that I as a journalist, I feel like I'm a mile wide and an inch deep. I like learning about subjects and that I didn't know a lot about. I love the fact gathering process, and then I like the writing. I mean, I got into journalism because I wanted to because of the writing, not because I was passionate about reporting the news, but the writing process. Though once you've gathered all that information, is a process of organization, and I like communicating things to people in a clear and appetizing way. And obituaries fit that template very nicely. I mean, the lead on an obituary, which is kind of a formula, so and so who did so and such and such, died on a certain date. But boiling down, the story of somebody's life, into a neat piece that engages people who might not have known anything about that particular person or that particular subject, whether it was science or theology, to me is a very enjoyable process.
One more question, and then we're going to do a couple of rapid fire.
All righty.
And that's for the podcast part. What advice would you give young journalists who are entering, unfortunately, maybe fortunately, a rapidly changing media landscape? What advice would you give
Is it
them?
too late to go back to law school? I mean, I'm serious. I mean, I wish I had good advice. I'm very, I shouldn't say this. I mean, there are lots of opportunities, but it's much, much harder. I was, I had the gift of being part of, kind of a little bit later, but during the Woodward Bernstein era of people that went into this field because of the Woodward and Bernstein's coverage in the 1970s. So journalism schools were flooded with people, and there was just a vast media landscape. Whether you were wanted to write for magazines or your local newspaper, I mean there was just many opportunities, and those opportunities are. I will misquote, but I think the numbers are that there's been 50,000 journalism jobs eliminated in the last 10, 15 years in this country. I mean, I just wrote a obituary for a guy who was the editor-in-chief and publisher of the Village Voice, the leading alternative newspaper in the country, and it was just killed by the internet. I mean. Yeah. It was a vital, thriving, wonderful, institution, and that I stole from, as a style editor, and Craigslist killed them. Free classified ads, just undercut the business model for the alternative weekly, field everywhere in the country. I guess there's lots of places to write for online. I mean, I used to tell people that ask that question, well, start a blog, but that to me he feels dated too.
Yeah.
I mean, you want to be able to write, and you want to find a place that'll, you can't expect to make a lot of money, but you want to find a place that will let you publish your writing and get off social media.
Okay, let's get to know you outside of your work. So a couple of rapid fire questions. Favorite song or band?
Oh God, I don't have a favorite song.
Do you have a favorite band? Bands?
Well, old school, I would say REM or The Replacements. Who do I like currently?
Are you a Swiftie? Are you a Swiftie? In disguise.
I'm not a Swiftie, but I like and appreciate her music,
Yeah.
and I respect what she does. I was going to say Billie Eilish maybe is my favorite contemporary musician.
That's a surprising answer. I like it.
Okay.
Favorite book?
Oh, that's a tough one. I read a lot. My favorite book. I don't have a favorite book, but I have many favorite authors. I'm reading, Hilary Mantel's final installment of her Cromwell series called The Mirror and the Light. I just finished the last book by George Eliot called Daniel Deronda, which followed Middlemarch, which was maybe one of my favorite books. A lot of contemporary, fiction I think is excellent. So, yeah.
Do you have a favorite TV show or movie?
I don't watch a lot of TV. Do I have a favorite movie? I will name, recent movies I've seen the last couple of years. Anatomy of a Fall, which was one of the Oscar contenders last year. I thought was just a movie I've watched 2 or 3 times now. So yeah, I'll put that on there. 2001: A Space Odyssey, probably among the classics. I think is like one of the great movies.
Do you make your bed in the morning?
Yes, I do. I've become well, I don't know. I don't know if neatnik is the right word, but I have always liked order. In my house, in my desk, and I'm not a sloppy person. Yeah, so I do.
Favorite word?
Favorite word?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Um, um, when I first was a freelancer, before the Times hired me, I wrote a piece about a guy who was a modern day Timothy Leary. He was a great advocate of LSD, and I wrote a profile about him for the New York Times, and I described him as something. I had a sentence to the effect, something like, despite the preposterous sounding, theories he's throwing out, and the copy editor said, preposterous. That's a perfect New York Times word. So I will choose that one.
Like it.
I've used it many times in other stories.
It stuck with you, right? Like that's
Yes.
the word.
Well, what he said, and it is a good word. I mean,
Yeah.
it expresses skepticism, which I think is, should be your middle name if you're a journalist. Yeah.
Favorite quote?
Quote. Oh. I don't really have a motto, like, something I've printed out and put above my computer.
We can skip it.
Yeah. Without fear or favor, I'll choose another Times one.
There you
Yeah.
go. Early bird or night owl?
Definitely an early bird.
Apple or Android?
Say it again.
Apple or Android?
Oh, Apple.
Fiction or nonfiction?
Fiction.
Coffee, tea, or tequila?
Coffee.
Do you believe in ghosts?
No.
Do you have a bucket list?
No, and I don't like the idea of a bucket list.
Do you have a hero?
No.
Who would you rather write an obit about? Xi Jinping or an ostrich?
An ostrich
An
is
ostrich.
my choice?
Yeah.
I think Xi Jinping.
What's the strangest thing you've witnessed during your career? If there's
The very
one.
strangest thing, the very, very strangest thing. I should be able to answer that. What is the very, very strangest thing I've written about? Give me a minute. I've been doing this for a long time, so. I'll tell you by the end of the day. I'm not sure I
Sure.
know that. Yeah.
Best advice you've ever received?
When I was starting out as a journalist, and I left a weekly newspaper in New Mexico, which was my first job, and I was writing about high school sports, and I told the editor, I'm going to be a freelance magazine writer. That was what I was reading. That's what I loved. I'm going to start writing for the New Yorker. And the editor said, you know what? Write for Shoe World. In other words,
Start small.
lower your sights about 300 degrees, and it turned out to be really good advice, because I didn't write for Shoe World, but I wrote for a lot of, second and third tier magazines, and that was going back to your advice for new journalists. You gotta gain the experience somehow.
Mm-hmm. What's one thing you are truly terrible at?
Basketball.
Do you have a hidden talent?
A hidden talent.
Or a talent people don't know about?
That people don't know about, you mean?
Yeah.
A hidden talent. Yeah, I'm a pretty good sailor.
Favorite spot in northern Westchester?
Favorite spot?
In northern Westchester?
Ward Pound Ridge Reservation.
Okay, couple of fill in the blanks. If I never have to do blank again, I'll die a happy man.
Vacuum the house.
If I wasn't a journalist, I would be a...
God, I don't know. Third baseman.
If you want to get to know me, you should...
Read me.
The best thing about living in northern Westchester is?
It feels like New Hampshire within commuting distance of Manhattan.
I thought you were going to say our magazine.
Oh.